Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Teaching Through Times and Seasons. I am on the road currently, so not in my usual location of taping, but I am taping this ahead of time because I will be on the road most likely on Friday when this generally shows. And so, because I've been on the road, I know a lot of times my teaching style can be very word heavy, have a lot of scripture contained, and I like the balance of the prophetic and scripture, and I like those two to balance well together. However, because of the amount of preparation that requires and the activity, I've preached 3 times in a week and a half, and I've been in 2 conferences, and so do not really have the time to develop this in terms of the word. But this is really a prophetic revelation that the Lord was showing me as I've been driving. And I don't know if you're like me. A lot of times I think, hey, I'm going to be on the road. I'm going to have time with the Lord and He's going to speak to me. And usually it doesn't work that way for me. Occasionally it does, but usually it doesn't. But I had one particular stint of time in this trip that I believe God and Google Maps were working in conjunction with one another because I was taking what should have been a fairly familiar route between two cities and really expected, I knew what roads I'd be on, and so I was expecting where I was anticipating where I was going to stop and the different places I would see along the way. And Google Maps took me on a route that included none of those roads that I anticipated being on. In fact, it really took me between two major cities on no highways. Everything was a back road. And I didn't really see the route ahead of time, but I did see the time that it was going to take to make this trip. And I couldn't argue with the time. The time was, as quick and likely quicker than it would have been for me to take the major highways. And so, as far as those stops I thought I was going to make along the way, none of that happened. But the Lord was, even in that, even when I first got on the road and began to realize over the course of my journey that we're not getting ready to merge onto some major highway that I thought I would be traveling on. And I realized that the Lord was taking me on some what I felt like were ancient paths. And that even on these ancient paths, there was acceleration. I was not able to go 70 miles an hour, 65 miles an hour, most of the route, some of it. And yet I was still getting to my destination, in fact, quicker than I would have if I had traveled those major roads. And so the Lord was saying to me, there is acceleration on the ancient paths, and that there are times that, for whatever reason, the Lord cannot communicate to us. Definitely, I know He would not have been able to talk to me about the things He was talking to me about on that trip if I was on the busy thoroughways, if I was making those stops along the way that I anticipated being able to make at these stores and such. He would not have been able to speak to me about the season that we're in and the location I was in at the time. And I just sensed that the Lord may choose to remove us somewhat from the chaos and the distraction of our modern routes of the way that we normally do things, may eliminate some of that, some of those distractions so that He can speak to us, so that He can have our full focus and get our attention in those areas where He wants to talk to us. So there may be some changes coming up, and I'm almost certain that there are some changes coming up that may look like a step backwards. Like this is not the modern way of doing things, but God is saying, no, they're ancient paths, and you can actually get to your destination quicker on these ancient paths if you'll just cooperate with me. So I relaxed into the journey. I chose not to be concerned or worried or upset about where I am. I don't know where I am because I'm not on these major roads that I'm familiar with. And really, this whole trip has been a lot about learning how to rest and trust God on the journey. If you don't know, I've been on a over 2 week road trip and am getting ready to make my way back home. And so I've been resting and relaxing into, leaning into the Lord in this process. And so that's what I did and allowed Him to begin to speak to me because He had to show me some things on these ancient paths that honestly I'd have never seen on the major roadways. I know I'd already traveled those ways. And so I hadn't noticed any of these things that He was showing me. So I'm in Oklahoma, or was in Oklahoma. I'm now currently in Texas. I was in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has experienced the driest year this year in 100 years, like drier than the Dust Bowl. So, so the Lord was showing me some areas where there should have been water, that there was no water. He was showing me a lot of rivers and lakes where you could see how far down the water levels were there, and just the level of dryness. Now, it's really interesting to me because I've lived in Oklahoma for 26 years and just moved to Arizona a year ago, little over a year ago. And the portion of Arizona where I live in the southeastern part of the state has this year had the wettest monsoon season, which is our major rains. We've had the wettest monsoon season in recorded meteorological history of the state. So, major shiftings going on. And yet, what the Lord was showing me about Oklahoma, I really believe applies all over. It wasn't just for the state, it was, I believe it occurred in the state for some specific reasons, which I'll explain. But I believe it's a picture of what is actually happening, and it's not all bad. What is actually happening in the church and the world. And so it's just fascinating to me how the weather can speak, and yet we have just different things. Obviously, there's a great rearranging. I believe that many people have said that the weather patterns would change. This is a clear indication of that. For this portion of Arizona to have the wettest year ever in Oklahoma, that normally has a pretty substantial amount of rain. I mean, this is the area where I was in is the area we call green country, and it comprises several counties, but green country is called green country for a reason because we always have a lot of water and rain to sustain the trees and the greenery in the area. And so there's some shifting going on. Now, obviously, um, we know that the enemy does things to to distract us. There are attacks that happen. There are things that happen to keep us from fulfilling our calling and our destiny, right? And so, Oklahoma, just a little bit of history here on the prayer movement. Don't lose me because don't, tune out because I'm talking about the prayer movement because it applies to the church at large. But a little history about the prayer movement in particular. Um, the organization that I was in Oklahoma to go to the annual conference is Heartland Apostolic Prayer Network. And it began in Oklahoma in 1995 as the Oklahoma Concert of Prayer. Now, it was a very organized, systematic network of prayer across the entire state by counties. And at some point, I don't know which year, Chuck Pierce and Dutch Sheets came in, ministered in this context, and saw the organization that OCOP was operating under and said, this is a model of intercession, and we need to duplicate this across the nation. And so at that point, it became the Apostolic Prayer Network. And then there's now one in every state of the nation. So now it's Oklahoma Apostolic Prayer Network, and HAPN, and that's what I'm a part of in Arizona, is the Arizona Heartland Apostolic Prayer Network. But that began there in Oklahoma. So in many ways, Oklahoma is an epicenter of intercession. So what we're seeing happen, because when I say intercession, I need you to hear I'm not just talking about prayer. If you think back to the the original call of Israel to become a nation, really before Israel was a nation, it was just a group of people that God had been choosing certain individuals, certain men, to carry his seed from generation to generation, into which he was going to develop for himself a nation. And the call, we find out in Exodus, the call of this nation is to be a nation of priests. Like the whole nation was called to be a priesthood. Now, what is a priesthood? Well, a priesthood is an intercessory position. The priests stand to intercede between God and mankind. That's the function of priests. And so in that sense, intercession is not just prayer. When you intercede in a situation, you get involved. The true meaning of intercession is to step in between two opposing parties in order to bring reconciliation between the two. So we had a sinful world that had rebelled against God and fallen into sin. And then you have this nation, or what was intended by God to be a nation of priests. And God intended for this nation of priests to serve as intercessors between God and man, and to be able to communicate the ways and the will of God to the world, to the whole earth. So even though God chose Israel, he didn't choose Israel in order to condemn the world. He chose Israel in order to redeem the world through Israel, which ultimately, of course, he did through the birth of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. So that's the purpose of intercession. When I say intercession, yes, often that is manifested in the prayer movement. But it is not just about the prayer movement. So when I'm talking about intercession, if you think I'm not a prayer warrior, don't think that you're not an intercessor, because all of the church is called now. The church now is in that position as the nation of priests. That's according to Peter, that we are now the nation of priests, and our job is to intercede between God and man. So, because Oklahoma is an epicenter for intercession, we have this manifestation here. We know that the enemy brings attacks, the enemy brings things against us, in this case, drought and many other things as well. But manifesting most obviously on this trip was the drought. Um, in order to distract us from our own to our own need, to our own issues, so that we won't fulfill our purpose, so that we won't be interceding for the world. We won't be stepping in between God and man. We won't be bringing the communication of heaven to earth, because we are so trapped in our own issues. So that is what the enemy's trying to do through this drought that I was seeing. But that's obvious, right? Like, you don't have to be prophetic to understand that attacks come against you, attacks come against the body, attacks come against the church in order to keep us from fulfilling our destiny. We all know that. So my question was, as I was driving, okay, Lord, I see what the enemy's doing. That's clear. What are you doing in this situation? And so as I'm driving and I'm observing the landscape, it's still beautiful. I am driving through beautiful country. Now, this is country that's close to my heart. Lived here for a long time, lived there for a long time, but it is dry and barren. Yet, even in this barren state, it is beautiful. And it's really kind of a manifestation of a true fall season. And truly, the trees and the leaves were looking very pretty. They were in the process of turning over the time, the week and a half or so that I was in Oklahoma, I was seeing the changing of the leaves. The leaves were frequently being blown as I'm driving and just showering my car with beauty. I mean, it was really gorgeous, but it was a true fall season because I was seeing this manifestation of dryness and things actually dying out. Now, Chuck Pierce had said recently at Oasis Church, I may have mentioned this on a previous episode, but this struck me. I knew it was speaking to me, but I know it's speaking to the church. Chuck Pierce said, some of you are going to have to be very wise right now in this season, is what he was saying. Some of you are going to have to be very wise. Wait for some things to die out, and then you will be ready to move into position. Let me say that again. Some of you will have to be very wise. Wait for some things to die out, and then you will be ready to move into position. So I feel like there are many people who will relate to this feeling or this concept of not not knowing what your position is. And you have this vague understanding, or you believe you do, of who you are and what you are made for, but there's not a position you can see to plug into that is a fulfillment of your purpose. And I really believe that's because that position doesn't exist yet. You have to wait for some things to die out. And that position will then be created by the gifting and calling that exists in you. And so there's a lot of people, I believe, that are in that situation. And this that is manifesting right now in the natural realm as 100-year dryness in the epicenter of intercession, that that is actually an image of this dying out process that we are in. So don't view it as just being bad. We know what the enemy's doing, right? I was really, as I'm praying, I was really expecting the Lord to speak to me about what is our breakthrough strategy? What do we do to end the drought, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I was kind of trying to pray into and anticipating to hear from the Lord, because I knew I'd be spending time not just with Heartland Apostolic Prayer Network, but with Oklahoma Apostolic Prayer Network specifically. And I was hoping to be able to bring a word on what can we do? What is our divine strategy to be able then to shift the weather patterns? But that's not what the Lord was talking to me about. And in fact, I'll just say this now. As I left Oklahoma and I was driving to Texas, there was such severe rain that came on that day that I couldn't drive again on the major highways. I had to get off because the rain was coming so hard. I could not see the road at those high speeds, and I had to go on a lesser used highway that I could drive slower and be safer to get down to Dallas, the Dallas area. And those rains continued all the way from northeastern Oklahoma all the way to Dallas and south. And so just to let you know, God already has a plan. That's what I'm saying. God already has a plan to deal with this issue in the natural realm, but he's trying to communicate to us what he's wanting to do in the spiritual realm and what this means. So this is the dying out process, and many of you are in limbo waiting for a position to open up that does not yet exist in the current structure. So we've observed, particularly in the prayer movement, but and various prayer networks, because by the way, there's a lot of prayer networks, but also in a more general sense in ministries, organizations, in the church at large, we have noticed that there is a shaking. And this is a manifestation of that shaking in the natural realm. There is a shaking that's going on. And obviously when things are shaken, they fall apart. But there's this word, this phrase in the Old Testament, actually talking about tithing, but this phrase keeps coming to my heart as I'm observing the shaking that is going on in the church, in these prayer movements, in these organizations, and that term is shaken together. And so I hear the Lord saying that, yes, we're being shaken to pieces in a sense. We are being shaken to fall apart so that those pieces can then be reassembled by God into the current pattern that he wants us to be in. So we're being shaken not to separate or not to divide, but we're being shaken so that we can be shaken together in the proper structure for this new season that we're coming into. So he can reassemble us, and the end result will be more cohesive. The end result will be more united than we are currently. And so it is okay. You might need to hear this. It's okay if some groups, some organizations, some structures collapse in the shaking, and and it's not because they're bad. It's because God's reassembling some things. So this recently, very recently, I had to get rid of some possessions. There were some things that God had me get rid of, and it was difficult for me. For one, like many of you, I tend to be pretty thrifty and, attempt to be a good steward of my finances, a good steward of my possessions. And yet I had to get rid of things that were functional, that worked. But it was necessary in the season for me to dispose of them, not even to be able to pass them on and feel better about that. But no, I had to throw some things away. That's, things that are in good condition. That's hard for us to do in the natural. But I was familiar with these things. I knew how to use them. They worked for me, kind of like those modern roadways, those major thoroughfares that I was very accustomed to driving on. I knew where my stopping points were. I knew where to get gas along the way. I knew where to stop and eat because I was familiar with those pathways. And I was familiar with these possessions. I knew how they fit into my life. I had a pattern, I had a routine, and yet I had to get rid of those things. The Lord provided some new things, some new vessels during that time period. And there are things right now that are truly good. I want you to hear this. The shaking that God is doing it's not because these structures, these organizations, these things are bad. It's not that at all. They're chaff. Now you understand the purpose of chaff is to protect the grain as it grows. But there comes a time when that grain, for it to be useful, the chaff has got to be disposed of. So those structures and organizations and things that are being shaken right now, and we don't know what when the end result comes about, what it's going to look like, what's the manifestation going to be. So we don't know what is God shaking apart to reassemble separately in some other way. I'm not sure, or what is going to survive the shaking. But there are things that are chaff, and they were good, and they helped us to grow, but they do not have the ability to carry what we need to carry into this next season. There has to be new vessels given for that purpose, and God is distributing those things. So these things that are being shaken aren't being shaken because of sin. Some things are. Obviously there's evil in the world, there's evil in organizations, there's things that are being exposed. All that's happening because everything that can be shaken is being shaken. The kingdom, the unshakable kingdom of God, is what will remain. Now, the structures, maybe they'll just all disintegrate, but there will be foundational and relational structures, networks, whatever we want to call them, that we can operate in. It may not be what we're accustomed to. It may not be what we know how to use. It may take a learning curve for us to step into these new positions that we were actually created for and built for, but that don't exist currently in the current structure and system that we are in. So, there may be a major shifting, and it may be very awkward and very uncomfortable. My suggestion, what I've been doing even on this trip as the Lord's been speaking to me, is just in rest and repentance, i.e., turning to God. Through rest and through turning to God is your salvation. In quiet trust and confidence is your strength. Isaiah 30:15. Again, in quiet trust and confidence is your mastery. So what that word means. You can master any situation as you trust God, as you're confident in his ability, not yours. You don't have to be confident in your ability to hear God clearly. You don't have to be confident in your ability to know what to do. Just be confident in his faithfulness. And that as long as you're looking to him, you're seeking him for the right way on the ancient paths, then he will guide and direct you as you turn to him. Look to him, but rest. Be at peace. Do not allow anxiety and fear and doubt and unbelief, which is what all that is, doubt and unbelief. That's really what that anxiety and fear and worry and concern is. Don't allow those things to cause you to get your eyes off of the Lord. Allow the uh, the shift and the change to give you a chance to tune into what God is saying and to separate from the distractions that we live with every day. So there's the balance here. I want you to see this balance. we have we started talking about the ancient paths that actually can accelerate the progress of our journey, and yet we're talking about chaff that needs to be gotten rid of. What I'm saying is this isn't the old versus the new. It's not that. So the ancient paths are old, and yet the chaff is old, but it has to be disposed of. It's a spirit-led journey where you're allowing the Lord to distinguish and to differentiate between those things that are going to survive the shaking into the next season and those things that aren't. And even if we don't know what those are, we just rest and relax into the journey and allow Him to create for us the positions that we, in fact, were created for, right? Okay, I hope that helps. I will see you again next week, and perhaps we'll pick up again on the Great Communion Revival, because there's still a couple more things that we need to talk about on that particular subject.